There's a map sitting in a vault somewhere in the Pentagon that shows exactly how World War III unfolds, and the alliances on it would absolutely blow your mind. We're not talking about the obvious NATO versus Russia scenario everyone expects. This map shows something way more terrifying, something that keeps intelligence analysts up at night, and it starts with a single miscalculation in the South China Sea that spirals into the one conflict nobody saw coming. The wildest part? The countries that end up on the same side would have seemed impossible just 5 years ago, and the nation that stays neutral might actually be the most shocking twist of all. Here's what nobody wants to admit. Every military strategist worth their salt knows that the next global conflict won't look anything like the clean East versus West narrative we're fed. The real powder keg isn't where you think it is, and when it blows, the shockwaves will redraw the map in ways that seem absolutely insane until you understand the deeper game being played. We're talking about alliances that make zero sense on paper, but perfect sense when you follow the money, the resources, and the raw survival instincts of nations backed into corners. Let's set the scene. It's 2026, and a Chinese naval vessel collides with a Philippine fishing boat in disputed waters near the Spratly Islands. Sounds minor, right? But here's where things go sideways. The Philippines, invoking their mutual defense treaty with the United States, calls for immediate support. The U.S. responds by sending the 7th Fleet into the area. China sees this as an escalation and declares an exclusion zone around the entire South China Sea. American ships cross it anyway. Within 72 hours, we've got a naval standoff involving 3 carrier strike groups, and tensions are through the roof. Now here's where the map starts looking weird. India, which has been playing both sides for years, suddenly has to make a choice. They've got border disputes with China that have already turned deadly in the past, and they're looking at Chinese encirclement through the string of pearls strategy. You'd think they'd side with the US, right? But hold up. Russia, traditionally China's partner, makes a move that changes everything. They offer India a deal, neutrality guarantees, continued weapons supplies, and support against Pakistan in exchange for staying out of the South China Sea mess. India takes it, and just like that, the world's largest democracy sits this one out. That's 1.4 billion people, and a massive military off the board. But wait, it gets crazier. Japan and South Korea, both with US bases and mutual defense treaties, go all in on America's side. That's expected. What nobody predicted was Australia not just supporting the US, but actually proposing the most aggressive military strategy in the room. The Aussies have watched China's influence creep into the Pacific for decades, buying up island nations, building ports, establishing presence. They've decided this is their line in the sand, and they're pushing for immediate blockade operations. We're talking about closing off the Malacca Strait, choking Chinese trade routes, going straight for the economic jugular. Vietnam makes a choice that surprises absolutely no one who knows their history. They've fought China more recently than they fought America, and they're not about to let Beijing control their waters. They open their bases to US forces, and suddenly America has staging grounds right on China's southern border. The South China Sea is now a cauldron with military assets from half a dozen nations all crammed into a space smaller than the Mediterranean. Here's where the map gets really wild. Turkey, a NATO member, looks at this situation and sees opportunity. Erdogan's been playing both sides for years, buying Russian missiles while staying in the Western alliance. When the shooting starts in Asia, Turkey announces it's closing the Bosphorus Strait to all military vessels as a peacekeeping measure. That's Russia's only warm water access to the Mediterranean, completely blocked. Russia is furious, but they can't do anything about it because they need Turkey's neutrality more than they need the strait open. It's a power move that basically splits NATO down the middle because half the alliance thinks Turkey just betrayed them while the other half thinks it's brilliant crisis management. The European response is where things get messy. Germany, France, and the UK issue a joint statement condemning the conflict and calling for immediate de-escalation. Sounds reasonable. Except they also announced that NATO's Article 5 Mutual Defense Clause doesn't apply to offensive operations in disputed territories. Translation: America, you're on your own. The political backlash in Washington is immediate and severe. 70 years of alliance architecture starts cracking apart in real time. Poland and the Baltic states absolutely lose it. They're watching Western Europe basically abandon America, and they know if Russia gets any ideas, they're the first targets. Poland starts mobilizing its military and makes a direct bilateral agreement with the United States outside of NATO framework. Romania and Bulgaria follow. Suddenly, you've got an Eastern European coalition that's more committed to U.S. partnership than the actual NATO alliance, and the center of gravity in European security shifts about 1,000 miles east. Now let's talk about the Middle East, because this is where it gets properly chaotic. Saudi Arabia and the UAE look at a potential U.S.-China conflict and see their worst nightmare. They sell oil to everyone. And a prolonged war means their two biggest customers are either fighting each other or dealing with massive economic disruption. They announce immediate neutrality and increase oil production to keep prices stable. Iran, seeing an opportunity with America distracted, starts getting aggressive in the Strait of Hormuz. Israel goes on high alert. But here's the twist. China offers Iran a deal. Stay out of the conflict, keep the oil flowing, and Beijing will guarantee protection from any U.S. or Israeli strikes. Iran takes it, and suddenly we've got Chinese security guarantees in the Persian Gulf. That's a geopolitical earthquake nobody saw coming. Back in the Pacific, the first shots are fired. A Chinese J-20 fighter locks onto an American F-35, and someone's nerves break. Missiles fly, both aircraft go down. Now we're not in standoff territory anymore. We're in actual shooting war territory. The U.S. imposes a total embargo on Chinese goods and freezes all Chinese assets in American banks. We're talking trillions of dollars. China retaliates by dumping U.S. Treasury bonds and nationalizing every American company operating in Chinese territory. Apple, Tesla, Ford, all of them gone overnight. The global economy doesn't just stumble, it straight up seizes. Here's what happens to regular people in this scenario. Gas prices in America triple within a week because shipping insurance through Asian waters becomes impossible to get. Inflation, which everyone thought was bad before, goes absolutely parabolic. Every electronic device, every piece of clothing, every cheap consumer good that came from China or passed through those shipping lanes is now either unavailable or costs 3 times as much. Store shelves start looking sparse within a month. We're not talking bread lines yet, but we're talking about real scarcity in ways Americans haven't experienced since World War II. In China, the situation is even more severe. Their economy is export-dependent, and suddenly they can't export to their biggest markets. Unemployment spikes. The government imposes strict rationing and ramps up nationalist propaganda to keep social cohesion. There are reports of unrest in major cities, but information coming out of China becomes scarce because the internet gets heavily restricted. The Communist Party is fighting a war on 2 fronts, one external, one internal. The military situation escalates. U.S. submarines start targeting Chinese naval vessels in the South China Sea. China responds by launching cyber attacks that take down major portions of the American electrical grid. The Northeast goes dark for 3 days in winter. Hospitals run on backup generators. People actually die from the cold and from medical equipment failures. This is no longer some distant war, it's hitting home hard. Japan gets hit with missile strikes on U.S. bases in Okinawa. The casualties are mostly American, but Japanese civilians die too. Tokyo faces a decision, go all in or try to negotiate out. They choose escalation, and Japanese self-defense forces engage Chinese naval units for the first time since World War II. South Korea starts getting nervous because North Korea is acting weird, mobilizing forces but not saying anything. Is Pyongyang going to use this chaos to make a move south? Seoul has to split its attention between supporting U.S. operations against China and preparing for a potential northern invasion. Taiwan becomes the next flashpoint. China decides that if they're already at war with America, they might as well solve the Taiwan issue now. Amphibious assault forces start massing. The U.S. sends every available asset to defend Taiwan, because if the island falls, American credibility in Asia evaporates completely. The battle for Taiwan becomes the largest naval engagement since World War II. We're talking carrier battles, submarine warfare, massive airstrikes. The strait is littered with burning ships from both sides. Taiwanese cities get bombed. Millions of civilians are sheltering in subway stations and basements, living through something they only knew from their grandparents' stories. Here's where the nuclear question comes up, and it's terrifying. Both sides have nukes. Both sides know using them means mutual destruction. But when you've got thousands of people dying daily, when your economy is collapsing, When your leadership is under pressure to show strength, the unthinkable starts getting thought about. The U.S. moves some of its nuclear forces to higher alert status. China does the same. We're now closer to nuclear war than we ever got during the Cold War. And that's saying something. Russia watches all this and makes calculated moves. They increase pressure on Ukraine, figuring NATO is too fractured and America too distracted to respond effectively. They take more territory in the east. The Ukrainians fight hard, but without consistent Western support, they're losing ground. Belarus, fully under Russian control at this point, becomes a staging ground for operations against Poland. If things escalate further, the Baltics start digging trenches. Africa becomes a proxy battleground. China has massive investments across the continent, especially in infrastructure and mining. The U.S. starts offering counter deals, trying to peel away Chinese influence. Several African nations find themselves with leverage they've never had before, playing both sides for maximum benefit. Others descend into proxy conflicts as local factions get backing from different external powers. The continent, which spent decades trying to escape Cold War proxy dynamics, finds itself right back in that nightmare. Latin America mostly tries to stay neutral, but it's complicated. Brazil, which has economic ties to China, announces neutrality but quietly keeps trading. Mexico, which can't afford to alienate the United States, offers support but keeps it mostly symbolic. Argentina sees an opportunity and announces it's reclaiming the Falklands, figuring Britain is too distracted to respond. They're wrong. The Royal Navy sends a task force, and suddenly there's a completely separate war in the South Atlantic that nobody needed. 6 months into the conflict, neither side is winning. The U.S. has naval superiority and has severely damaged China's ability to project power, but they haven't achieved anything decisive. China is economically wounded but not broken, and they've successfully defended their coast and maintained control over the South China Sea close to their territory. Taiwan is devastated but still standing. Barely. Casualties on all sides are in the hundreds of thousands. The global economy is in freefall. Every major stock market has lost more than half its value. Trade has contracted to levels not seen since the 1930s. Peace talks start. Mediated by Switzerland and Singapore, two of the few neutral parties with credibility on both sides. The terms being discussed would have seemed impossible before the war. China keeps its South China Sea claims but agrees to international arbitration. Taiwan gets formal independence guarantees but has to accept permanent neutralization, no foreign military bases. The U.S. withdraws most forces from the region but maintains alliance commitments. Everyone loses something. Everyone gains something. And nobody's happy, but everyone's exhausted. The post-war map looks nothing like the pre-war world. NATO is effectively dead, replaced by a series of bilateral defense agreements that leave Western Europe isolated. Eastern Europe is now the front line of American alliance structure. China is weakened but not destroyed, still a major power but no longer rising unchecked. Russia has gained territory but finds itself more isolated than ever, with even China keeping distance. India emerges as the big winner, having stayed neutral, maintaining relations with everyone, and positioning itself as the next rising power in a world where the previous two superpowers bloodied each other. The economic reorganization takes decades. Supply chains that took 30 years to build are gone and have to be reconstructed. Countries prioritize domestic production in critical sectors, even though it's more expensive. Globalization doesn't die, but it fundamentally transforms into something more regional and less interconnected. The internet splinters into American, Chinese, and European networks that barely talk to each other. We've entered a new era of managed separation. Real talk, the scariest part of this scenario isn't any single battle or alliance shift. It's how fast everything that seems stable and permanent just dissolves when the pressure hits. Treaties that looked ironclad turned out to have more exceptions than rules. Economic ties that were supposed to prevent war became weapons of war. The international order that kept things relatively peaceful for 70 years collapsed in months because nobody was willing to truly compromise until after catastrophic destruction forced them to. The map nobody wants to show you isn't frightening because of who fights whom. It's frightening because it shows how thin the ice really is under the entire global system, how quickly everything we take for granted can change, and how alliances based on convenience rather than shared values crumble the moment things get real. That map exists in some classified database, and the people who've seen it understand something the rest of us are just beginning to realize. The post-1945 world order isn't inevitable, isn't permanent, and might be closer to its expiration date than any of us want to believe. The next global conflict won't be about ideology or good versus evil. It'll be about resources, pride, and the brutal logic of nations that feel they have no choice but to fight. And when that map becomes reality instead of contingency planning, everything changes in ways we're not prepared for.